Thank you very much for your presentation, and I think we would definitely like to hear more from you. I would just move on to the questions which we have received a few. I don't see with anyone having especially put a name to it, so what I'll do is that I will actually just uh, unmute all of you, and I will just read out the question, and then anyone who wants to reply to that can reply, or all of you can reply. One is about the funding of the Taliban funds. Although I did saw a kind of a cruel, a kind of a joke that if somewhere on social media is that if the Taliban needs funding, they could probably hand over half of their government and receive the bounties put out by the US, $5 million each. So that is one way of running the government. But this is a much more serious question: is in terms of funding, do you see if that aid is not going to come, or if that aid is going to flow into pockets of the Taliban? Dr. Mehran mentioned the corruption issues which have been there, which have plagued the country earlier as well. So where do you see that funding coming from? Could it, of course it will, could it be drugs? Will it be drugs? And aside from drugs, where do you see that funding coming from? Anyone?
If I may pitch in one point, is the Taliban does depend, the government, the stability or the survival of their government in whatever form would also require funding, international aid, because the previous government of Afghanistan was dependent on its budget for 75% of its budget, at least, for international aid. So the Taliban does know that and realizes that. And that's why, in general, it is trying to put out that image that the rest of the world wants to see of it. However, there are certain worries and concerns right now that the Taliban, if the international community pushes the Taliban back and pushes against them, that the Taliban might turn into other sources of funding. They do have some illicit economy that they can rely upon. They do get also, there are concerns that the Taliban might get closer and closer to regional actors such as China, such as Russia, and also Iran. That could also be another possibility, because so far the Chinese government, for example, has shown slightly warmer relationship with the Taliban, and the Taliban has already outreached to them saying that these would be our economic and strategic partners in the future. So it would be difficult for the Taliban government to survive without the international funding and international aid in general. The impact would be quite dire on the, if that humanitarian aid does not reach Afghanistan, on the general population. It might not harm the Taliban as much, the Taliban group per se, but in the short term, at least, it will going to have a very negative impact on the population. That would be my quick take on that.
I could say something, but it would be basically just to echo that almost entirely. They have to, I mean, Afghanistan has been dependent on international funding for many years, and that's not going to change with the Taliban. They absolutely need international community funding. There's a certain amount they might get from narcotics and trafficking, but obviously this is one of their strongest platforms, is that they are opposed to poppy and narcotic production. I'm not quite sure whether that will be applied, but they have a certain amount of money that they could rely upon. What I've seen when the Taliban control an area, a province or a district, I mean, we've had a chance to observe some of their behaviors over the years. They seem to run it in a very crude kind of war economy. I mean, they can set up checkpoints and they can tax truck drivers, people passing by for whatever reasons, and they'll give them written receipts and such like, so they bring a little bit of money that way. I think they work on the assumption that the international community, the humanitarian side of the international community, will always turn up in Afghanistan and keep the healthcare going, clinics, basic education, healthcare, food insecurity, all those sort of things. I think they factor that in, so they can run like bumping along the surface, like some kind of crude war economy, and rely to some extent on the humanitarian aid. That'll always come in. I think they factor that in. And I like this other idea from Ms. Mehram of getting covert funding from other places, regional actors. Obviously, that would be Pakistan, maybe from the Gulf, China, Russia, in exchange for specific favors. Maybe China wants to develop its Belt and Road, and you can imagine all the little covert deals that could be struck. So maybe they could get enough that way. And I think otherwise, I don't think the Taliban care as much as we want them to care about funding. I mean, they now control the whole country, and they're going to run it the way they want to run it. The international community will pick up the slack on the humanitarian side. And if the West wants to withhold the money, then it's the people that are going to suffer. Almost like, what's that kind of, like the hostage, holding the population as a hostage. You've got to do something because it's the people that will suffer. Almost like a North Korea sort of thing. You have to provide aid and assistance because the people will suffer.
If I could just add a very quick point to what Mr. Foxley also mentioned in terms of the Taliban aligning their ideological perspective and ideologies on drugs with their actions as well. When the Taliban were in power, they were sending boxes and boxes of opium outside the country, basically what they put on some of the boxes for consumptions for non-Muslims. So if we get to that point, that would be their approach in terms of addressing the drugs issues. Muslims or people in Afghanistan shall not consume these. These are for export only, essentially.
Dorothy, you would like to say something, or?
No, I think everything has been said. I don't know if we come back to China later on in the discussion.
Actually, that is again what Ms. Foxley said, and I want to go there. Is that there is a question which says you just mentioned the BRI, and there is a question is that how do you see the Taliban interacting with the BRI? Of course, there are certain covert favors to be extracted somewhere, and suddenly the warming up of the Chinese government was probably before they even took over Kabul. They were already recognizing them. But how do you see the BRI and the Taliban working out? Also, given the fact that security in Afghanistan and in the Afpak region is going to be a long issue and will remain volatile. At the same time, how do you see the Chinese maybe, using the services of Islamabad in order to get some hold in Afghanistan and strike these covert deals on the BRI?
If I may, I think there will be some covert deals. I think a lot of them will be actually quite overt. China is not particularly worried about human rights and good governance. So all they're waiting for is that Afghanistan is stable so that they can establish their project, the BRI project. And if the Taliban delivers, they're going to get the money and it won't be covered. It will be just outright there, will be part of the project, of the BRI project. So I think, and I think the Taliban know that. That's not a coincidence that before they took over Kabul, Baradar went to meet the foreign minister, and that was open. And China hasn't recognized the Taliban government, but it won't mind doing so as soon as Afghanistan offers the opportunity to establish their BRI projects. They already have some assets there. China already owns some mines and some territories there. So all they're waiting for is to exploit the potential. And I think the Taliban know that. That could be a huge funding for the Taliban. And I think they very well know that. So the BRI could actually play in favor of the Taliban eventually. And just want to make sure that I'm invoking here my right to hesitate, because we never know, of course. But I really think the Taliban know that, and they know that there are other regional players that don't care about human rights and about good governance and rule of law and all of that. And we tend to put a lot of emphasis on that in the West, but we're kind of forgetting a lot of other major players in Afghanistan that don't care about that, and that could actually empower the Taliban in that sense.
Move on to the next question, or anyone has something to add? No, okay. Then we have one question is that Pakistan has worked the West capitals in recent weeks, pushing the view it is now time to accept the Taliban government and to reach out. Should the West push back against this, or is it just realpolitik, making the point to Islamabad that given its own role in bringing down the previous government, it should be more or less, if you break it, you own it? So that's open for anyone as well. So, but I think Dorothy is waiting to get into that.
Yeah, I am. I'll confess. Pakistan has been doing that. Has been doing that for 20 years, trying to get the West to discuss with the Taliban and to open negotiations with the Taliban. So it's not particularly new from Pakistan to do that. And the fact is, we've been trying in the West to
I think we lost Dorothy. So she might, she's still online, but probably something with her, with the connection. So I hope she'll come back until then.
Policy.
Okay, sorry. Dorothy, we lost you for, I think, half a minute. So if you can, start your answer.
Sorry. So I was saying, as long as we don't have a kind of long-term continuing policy towards Pakistan, it's going to be realpolitik all the time. And as soon as our interests require it, we're just going to close our eyes on what Pakistan does, and we're going to take Pakistan as an ally again. And again, Pakistan is a nuclear state. And as soon as they raise that card, they kind of free out of jail kind of card, you know, and they can do anything because they raise that card. They actually do raise that card quite often, kind of do anything they want. And we comply. Basically, we comply.
That's why it's called the Great Game, isn't it?
It's called the Great Game. Yeah.
You've for 20 years, Pakistanis. 1 minute the Americans are courting the Pakistanis, the next minute the Americans are fed up with the Pakistanis, and the next minute it's back like that. And I don't think that's ever going to change, really.
Should it?
It's not a question of whether it should. It's a question of what's really going to happen. I don't think this could ever change. Yeah, unless you have a democratic government developing in Afghanistan, but that isn't on the cards.
Dr. Mehran?
Well, I hope it would, but because otherwise we do have a very grim picture of this whole cycle of violence continuing in Afghanistan, because until Pakistan is seeing Afghanistan as some sort of backyard, safe backyard, that safety net that what it wants to create there with a very weak government that they can operate and against for their own strategic purposes, we are going to have, well, I hope not, we are going to have similar issues in Afghanistan over and over again. We had a period of maybe 20 years. Yes, we did have some violence, but overall Afghanistan in the past 20 years, we had some development in the country, and look what happened again with the Taliban. And we have had this cycle of violence that Pakistan is a major player contributing to this cycle of violence in Afghanistan. And we do need to realize that it will continue like that unless this whole balance with this formula and balance with Pakistan changes, because we are always at the receiving end of it, that Afghan people are the receiving end of it, getting all the violence and paying all the prices essentially, because of these great games played by all actors, regional and international, in Afghanistan. So it is, I do understand it's realpolitik. I do understand it's going to be a very difficult and bumpy road, but I think it's about time to a wake up call for everybody, for Afghans in Afghanistan and outside as well, that we have to, all of us, work towards that, changing that situation, because otherwise we're not going to have peace in Afghanistan anytime soon, unless that balance is changed.
Thank you. No, we have two questions more, but just to actually go further on what you have said, Dr. Mehran, is, and again, from your perspective, and which is the right perspective, is that, of course, it's a great game and it's realpolitik, but at the end of the day, Afghan lives are at stakes, and it's used as a playfield. Well, I can maybe I can understand that coming from the region of Kashmir, because our region has also been used as a playfield. And so before I go to the other two questions, my question to the panel would be, is how do you see that developing? Because you did see, after the Soviet left, of course, the Pakistani military establishment started to divert these mujahideen, or at least their ideology, towards Indian administered part of Kashmir. And now that the Taliban is fully in control, do you see such a thing, which, you know, Mr. Foxley was also saying, history repeating itself? Do you see history repeating itself there as well? Because I can imagine Hafiz Sayed sitting in Lahore and thinking, well, you know, now his great game starts. If Sirajuddin Haqqani can become a minister, maybe Hafiz Sayed can become a minister of Kashmir 20 years from now, or Pakistan 20 years from now. So he probably sees his chances growing, and with him the Jaish-e-Mohammeds and what have you. So how do you see that that playing field being affected?
I can give that, I can express my opinion about that. You're absolutely right. With the Taliban taking over Afghanistan and putting characters like Sirajuddin Haqqani becoming the acting Minister of Interior in Afghanistan, this has given a lot of hope and strength to many terrorist organizations, regional and international. And this is part of the research that I'm doing, analyzing the rhetoric and media products by various terrorist organizations. They are thriving on this narrative of success, a success that is tangible and it can happen. It happened in Afghanistan, it can happen anywhere else. And that can actually strengthen their support base, that look, the Taliban in Afghanistan, they held on fighting for 20 years until, and this is their narrative, in inverse quotations, until they kicked out the most powerful countries, the US and Western countries, out of Afghanistan, out of the Islamic land. So this is the message that this whole victory indirectly has sent to many other terrorist organizations, and directly as well, with the close collaboration of Taliban with Al-Qaeda. So this has given them a lot of hope, and given many terrorist organizations a lot of hope. The Taliban, the Al-Qaeda, for example, TTP, Jaish-e-Mohammadi, all of them have become a lot more hopeful that it's possible, it's doable, and it increases their support base as well, because now they can easily recruit, build on that narrative, and a lot easily recruit more followers and attract more funding. And part of the funding actually might actually go to other organizations, because now the Taliban is in power. They're not fighting non-Muslims in Afghanistan. They're not fighting the invaders in quotation marks in Afghanistan, but now that funding can go somewhere else. And that has happened before. I mean, these terrorist organizations, for a lack of better word, they're competing against each other in a market, in a terrorist market, that funding is limited. And a lot of the time they've been competing against each other to attract that funding from various sources, individuals or otherwise organizations in the Middle East and elsewhere. So now that funding can be channeled somewhere else.
Please.
I like all those ideas. I'm just wondering. At the moment, Afghanistan has been taken over by the Taliban about 3 minutes ago, and we don't, as I said earlier, there's a lot of dust and heat up in the air. We don't know what's going to happen in Afghanistan. I don't think, well, the Taliban certainly don't know what's going to happen in Afghanistan. So I wonder, again, from a Pakistan perspective, but from a wider perspective, we need to wait and see if the Taliban are successful. I mean, we've called it a victory because we work on the basis, if you've captured a country, this is a victory. And I'm wondering whether the Taliban can digest. The Taliban have now bitten a massive mouthful. They've been nibbling away at districts and provinces. They've now, by accident and surprise, they've now this metaphor is not going to work very well, but they've now swallowed an entire football or huge object of your choice, which is now stuck in their throat. And I wonder if they can digest this. I wonder if it'll be good for them. And I wonder, the thing that bounces around in my head now is that the Americans, I wonder if life is now easier for the Americans once they've got over the embarrassment of losing and the evacuation and all that. The Americans no longer have to spend millions, billions of dollars propping up a government, billions of dollars on an Afghan army. And the people that they've been searching for in Pakistan, in the tunnels and caves of Tora Bora and in Doha, are now sitting openly in a few square miles of Kabul. I mean, maybe Habatullah Akhundzada isn't there, and maybe they'll put a few of their leaders in Kandahar just to keep them out of the way. But US drones, missile strikes, and even special forces raids, remembering what happened to Osama bin Laden eventually, the Taliban must understand this. So I wonder, and I also wonder whether the Taliban, I mean, enjoy isn't the right word, but I wonder if they'll find this difficult, unenjoyable, boring, stressful, hard work. They're publicly seen to fail. We've talked about all the social media and you know, they are now the government. People are looking at them and watching them. They can't hide in Pakistan. They can't hide in tunnels and caves. They can't hide in the Gulf. I wonder if it'll be a thoroughly difficult and unenjoyable experience for them that they will be seen every single day to fail at. And I wonder what example that might send. Like in months and years. Now, at the moment, they're all very excited. And I can see the message going out to all the other Islamist groups at Kashmir, you know, TTP. And I just wonder, maybe it won't be quite the victory and success and exciting thing to aspire to that they think it is at the moment. I think maybe this will prove difficult. I don't say it will bring about the downfall of the Taliban, but this is a big bite that they have to digest, and the Pakistani military system that has supported them. I don't necessarily think the Pakistani military and the ISI want to rush off to a new project just yet until they've seen how this works and how they digest this. Sorry, I've talked a long time now. It was just a half idea in my head when I started talking, but no, I'll stop there. I'll stop there.
Yeah, of course. That's.
I know there's some literature, some scientific literature in the West that works on far right extremism in the West, and they tend to say that one of the ways to kind of cut down on far right extremism is that if they do get in power, suddenly the people realize that, well, they can't deal with that because, as you said, Tim, it's kind of hard work, and some of those groups just thrive on the rhetoric of opposition and what they have to do something about governing. That's where the ideology and the rhetoric just kind of crumbles down. So I think you're right, and I think the Taliban are now confronting their biggest challenge yet, is that if they want to stay in power, well, they have to do something about it. But the bolstering of other terrorist groups, I think, is not going to be dependent on that, because other groups see that this group managed to get a country and to retake a country, and they could be bolstered by the idea that it's possible militarily, it's possible that even if the Taliban doesn't manage to stay in power, they could. So I'm not sure a failure of the Taliban would actually decrease the motivation of other groups. Again, my right to hesitate, but I'm not sure it would. As we have seen actually with the ISIS in Syria and Iraq, it did bolster other groups, even though eventually, kind of nothing much left.
Yes, I absolutely second that. In my night, they always twist the narrative around. They can do that. They got it. They were in control. The Taliban were in control, but then they got this wrong, and we can get that right.
Exactly.
So that's always, that option is always there for building another narrative, a different narrative.
Maybe we are also giving too much credit to the Taliban of thinking very strategically. Basically, they're just mullahs with a lot of guns who want to have power. And of course, the challenge now is to deliver governance, but that was not their agenda. It might come up now and they'll have to deal with it. And they indeed have taken a big bite, but I think that they are also, they are aware of the fact that you can spit out that bite and cut it in pieces and then start eating it. The question here is also, and that's a very funny question, I guess, is that, of course, do you think that the Taliban at some point of time will use, one is, of course, the discussion of other terrorist groups being inspired by them and then trying to follow their footsteps, which will happen definitely. The other question is, do you think the Taliban will actually use these terrorist groups as proxies or even work together with them? Like you do see the Haqqani network being included in the interim government, but also the other terrorist organizations like the Lashkars, the Jaish, do you see them working together, which I think they already do? But do you see the Taliban using them as proxies, maybe against the ISKP or what have you?
My gut instinct is that the Taliban have only ever been about Afghanistan. So ideas that they might export, I mean, and I know it's tricky when you get to Haqqani network and such, like with you know the overlapping connections. I guess if it comes to tackling ISKP in Eastern Afghanistan, I mean, they might even link up with the CIA, for goodness sake, you know, if it comes to that. So I could see tactical allegiances with other groups in the area. Maybe I'm being naive, but my instinct is that, to give Taliban credit, they're not about exporting terrorism. They are about using terrorist tactics in their own country to get what they wanted.
Then you're talking specifically about the Pashtun element of the Taliban and not the Haqqani Punjabi.
Yeah, well, yes, yeah, and I know it's a tricky one because there are these interconnecting networks that maybe the Taliban don't entirely control, but I think on balance, the senior leadership are not about exporting terrorism.
Anyone else? Then we have a last question. It's actually very interesting because of the fact that we mentioned all regional actors like Russia, like China. And there is this question, I guess, from someone from India saying, what is the role of India after Pakistan has, in the person's words, occupied the whole of Afghanistan with the help of the Taliban. So what is the role of India in that region? Or what should it be?
Well, India so far has been pretty, I bet like this whole situation has kept them on their toes in the Indian government right now. And it's, they are watching very, it's a worrisome situation for India, definitely. The Taliban has reached out to India as well. They spoke about continuing economic relationships with India. They tried to, the Taliban leadership, Zabiullah Mujahid mentioned a few times that it's the Taliban government is promising that the Afghanistan's soil will not be used against any government, for any threat against any government, but obviously India is cautious and worried about that promise and the delivery of that promise as well. From what I hear in Afghanistan as well, that India might, if the Taliban does not allows for terrorist organizations to strengthen in Afghanistan and then become a threat for India, that there are discussions inside Afghanistan, and what we hear from Afghan media as well, amongst journalists, that the resistance in Afghanistan, the military resistance in Afghanistan might get actually support from India as well. So one of the regional players that could militarily and financially support the resistance, the military resistance in Afghanistan would be India. So India always has that option as well in Afghanistan, which would feed into the whole cycle of conflict in the country. But nonetheless, it's there for India as well. So if it doesn't play a constructive, if the relationship and peaceful one with the Taliban, there is always that option of supporting the Taliban's opposition groups.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, India, like every neighboring country to Afghanistan, can play a positive role and a negative role, and they all kind of, to a greater or lesser degree, they do that. And you know, India has a lot of economic might. It has the ear of all the key players in Afghanistan and around. It can play a very important role. But in terms of dealing with the Taliban in a military way, as we were saying, if this goes wrong, it's one of the obvious rallying points for anti-Taliban resistance. It was in the 90s and could well be again. So I mean, like, all the neighbours have positive and negative roles. They all have their own kind of concerns and interests. India has a very big part to play economically, a massive role, if they can find some way of engaging with the Taliban. But if these things go wrong, and I'm pessimistic, 12 months, 24 months, things can go wrong. We may see India forming at least a rallying point, you know, maybe not with kind of public policy, but this is where people may gravitate towards or look to if fighting starts again.
Dorothy, do you have something to say?
Actually, not much. I think if everything has been said, I can only agree with both my other panelists here about India's role. So not much to add. I think one of the things that India really needs to be focused on right now is intelligence gathering regarding other groups that could target it. Again, coming back to our discussions, previous discussions, because other groups operating from Pakistan or from Kashmir could actually find motivation. And so I think India really needs to be careful and focus a lot of resources on intelligence gathering right now and counterterrorism.
Thank you. It has been a very, very interesting discussion, and although situation looks, of course, grim, there are, of course, some hopes expressed here and there. I am just, at the end of the day, I read somewhere that someone said, had you woken me up from a coma of 20 years, you would think that the world has gone crazy. And imagine imagine the picture of Sirajuddin Haqqani at Camp David. You know, where have we come to? And that just through the barrel of gun, and just brute force. So I do hope that the West and also regional powers, while there is no option maybe then to engage with the Taliban, do not forget that it is a terrorist organization. It is not a mass public uprising of the Afghan people. This is not what the Afghan people want. It is a terrorist organization which happens to be the more powerful at the moment there, and things can turn for the better tomorrow. So I think we should keep that in mind, that we're dealing with a terrorist organization, and having expectations, well, we must push for them, but having expectations of democracy and human rights might be a bridge too far. I would like to thank you all for this very interesting discussion. We will of course put this out on video to you as well in a day or two. And I would also like to say that from next month, we are actually starting a thing of having one-on-one or two speakers online, because, you know, Dorothy, how long has it been? And Mr. Foxley, 2 years or so that we have met, and this is one way of meeting. So until this Corona or COVID situation does not improve to the level that we can have open face-to-face meetings again, and maybe also with Dr. Mehran at some point of time when we would be able to travel there. But we will be starting next month one-on-one interviews, a bit more in depth about these situations. So we would like you all to join. One of my colleagues will send you an email, look at your availability, and I think this is a very good way of trying to get a scholarly perspective out on the situation, maybe less political. Of course, it's always intertwined, but a bit more scholarly. And while I am not a pessimist, I sometimes really like Mr. Foxley's pessimism, because it puts again back on track, thinking about how situations really are on the ground. So my concluding words would be, thank you very much for taking the time, and hopefully we will meet soon, either virtually or in person.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. See you again soon.
Thank you very much.